You think you're normal, but your habits quietly reveal what you lacked. Most people believe their behaviors are just personality traits or quirks. But what if many of them are actually adaptations, built quietly during moments when something important was missing? In this video, you'll start to see patterns you've never noticed before. We're breaking down subtle psychological behaviors shaped by childhood neglect and how they silently influence how you think, act, and relate to others. Some of these patterns look harmless, others even look like strengths. But beneath them, there's often a deeper logic your mind created to survive, not necessarily to thrive. Let's begin with something that seems almost admirable on the surface, being extremely independent. You handle everything yourself. You rarely ask for help. You take pride in not needing anyone. Most people see this as strength, and sometimes it is, but often it begins as a necessity. A child who learns early that support isn't reliable stops expecting it altogether. So, instead of relying on others, they rely only on themselves. Over time, this becomes identity. Not needing anyone feels safe, it feels controlled, but it also creates invisible distance. Self-aware individuals notice this pattern differently. They understand that independence is valuable, but isolation is costly. They allow support without feeling weak because they see connection as a resource, not a risk. Imagine being overwhelmed but refusing to reach out, not because no one would help, but because it feels uncomfortable to even try. That discomfort didn't appear randomly, it was learned. And the danger here is subtle. What protects you in one phase of life can quietly limit you in another. Independence becomes a shield that blocks both harm and connection. Now consider another behavior that feels completely normal. Constantly reading the room, you notice shifts in tone. You sense when someone is off. You adjust your behavior to keep things smooth. People call this emotional intelligence, and in many ways it is, but sometimes it's something else. It's hyper-awareness developed in unpredictable environments where emotional safety wasn't guaranteed. When a child grows up around inconsistency, they become highly attuned to emotional signals, not out of curiosity, but out of survival. Reading the room becomes a way to avoid conflict or rejection. The problem is, this doesn't turn off automatically. Even in safe environments, the mind keeps scanning, always analyzing, always adjusting. It becomes exhausting, even if it feels natural. More self-aware individuals begin to question this habit. They ask themselves, am I responding to reality or reacting to past patterns? That question alone can create distance from automatic behavior. Think about how often you change your tone, your words, even your opinions, just to maintain harmony. Not because it's authentic, but because it feels necessary. Here's where it gets deeper. This pattern can slowly disconnect you from your own needs. You become so focused on others that you lose clarity about what you actually feel or want. And that leads to a quiet form of resentment. Not loud, not obvious, but present. Because constantly adapting to others eventually costs you something internally. Let's move to another behavior that most people misunderstand. Struggling to accept compliments or kindness. When someone appreciates you, it feels uncomfortable, almost suspicious. You might brush it off, downplay it, or immediately redirect attention away from yourself. It seems like humility, but often it's something deeper. If appreciation was inconsistent or absent growing up, your mind doesn't fully register it as normal. Instead, it questions it, doubts it, sometimes even rejects it. So when someone genuinely values you, it creates tension, because it doesn't match the internal narrative you've built over time. Self-aware individuals start to notice this disconnect. They don't force themselves to believe every compliment immediately, but they stop rejecting it automatically. They sit with it, they observe the discomfort, and slowly they allow new evidence to reshape old assumptions. Now ask yourself something honestly. When someone appreciates you, do you feel calm or do you feel slightly uneasy? That small reaction reveals more than you think. It shows whether your mind sees validation as familiar or foreign. Let's go deeper into a pattern that looks like discipline but often hides something else. Overworking, constant productivity, always needing to be doing something. On the surface, it looks like ambition, drive, focus, and sometimes it is. But in many cases, it's also a way to earn worth that was never freely given. When a child feels unseen or undervalued, they often learn to associate worth with performance. Doing more becomes a way to feel enough. So rest starts to feel uncomfortable. Slowing down feels unproductive, and being still feels almost threatening because it removes the sense of earned value. More self-aware individuals begin to separate their worth from their output. They still work hard, but not to prove their existence. Instead, they work with intention, not desperation. Picture someone who can sit quietly without feeling guilty. That's not laziness, that's psychological stability. It means their sense of self isn't tied only to action. Now here's where things take a darker turn. These patterns, if left unexamined, don't just stay neutral. They can become self-sabotaging. Independence turns into emotional distance. Awareness turns into anxiety. Productivity turns into burnout. And humility turns into invisibility. What once protected you can slowly start working against you. And the most dangerous part is this. Because these behaviors feel normal, you rarely question them. You assume this is just who you are. But personality is often a story built from repeated adaptations. And stories can be rewritten, but only if you recognize them first. There's another pattern worth noticing: difficulty trusting people even when they've done nothing wrong. You might expect inconsistency. You might assume disappointment. So instead of fully trusting, you stay slightly guarded, just in case. This isn't irrational, it's patterned expectation. If reliability wasn't consistent early on, your mind learned to prepare for instability. But here's the problem: when you expect disappointment, you sometimes behave in ways that create distance, which then reinforces your belief. Self-aware individuals interrupt this cycle, not by blindly trusting everyone, but by evaluating people based on present behavior, not past memory. They allow trust to build gradually, instead of blocking it completely. That difference changes everything. Imagine forming relationships without constantly waiting for something to go wrong. That's not naive, that's recalibrated perception. Now let's pause for a moment. Out of everything you've heard so far, which pattern feels most familiar to you? Not the one that sounds interesting, the one that feels slightly uncomfortable to admit. That's usually where the real insight is. Because awareness isn't about labeling yourself, it's about understanding the logic behind your behavior so you can choose differently when needed. And here's something important: these patterns are not flaws. They are intelligent responses to specific environments. Your mind adapted in ways that made sense at the time. The issue isn't that these patterns exist, it's that they continue automatically, even when they're no longer necessary. That's where control comes in. Not control over everything, but control over your response once you recognize the pattern. You don't need to erase these traits, you need to refine them. Independence becomes strength when balanced with connection. Awareness becomes insight when balanced with calm. Productivity becomes powerful when it's driven by purpose, not pressure. And emotional sensitivity becomes clarity when it's not driven by fear. Toward the end, it comes down to something simple but difficult: choosing one pattern to observe in your daily life. Not all of them, just one. Notice when it shows up. Notice how it influences your decisions. And most importantly, notice that you have the ability to respond differently. Change doesn't happen through massive transformation. It happens through small, consistent awareness applied over time. If this made you see yourself differently, then you're already ahead of most people, because most never question what feels normal. If you want to keep exploring ideas like this, consider subscribing, not for content, but to be part of a group that chooses awareness over autopilot. And if something in this video resonated with you, share it in the comments. Sometimes, the patterns we think are personal are more universal than we realize. At the end of the day, you are not just the result of your past, you are also the one who can understand it. And once you understand it, you're no longer controlled by it in the same way. Because the moment you see the pattern clearly, it stops being invisible. And what's no longer invisible is something you can finally change.